One of the first things we talked about when it came to supporting your work was using cross-action tweezers, preferably the insulated kind, the kind with the wood on them. And what we were discussing in the previous video was the fact that you can either use these on their own, so you squeeze them and they will open and it will grip onto the thing that you want to support, and they can just sit there supporting it nicely, or you can use them in conjunction with a base. So this is a third hand base because it's an extra pair of hands when you want to do soldering. So this is going to hold the tweezers nice in position, and then you can twist it left and right, up and down, different angles, and again it will hold and support your work for you while you're doing your soldering, making sure that you have a nice tight join. If you're using the third hand base, some people struggle with it getting in nice and tight, so a little tip is to push it, hold onto your wire or whatever it is you want it to support for you, and instead of pushing it down so it's in contact with your base piece, actually move it over to the side slightly, push it down a little bit lower, and then pick the whole thing up and place it on your base. And therefore it should have a really nice tight join because there's going to be a little bit of gravity also weighing down on it. The other thing to take into consideration is they come in different shapes as well. So the pair I had just there were a pair of straight ones. These ones have a slight curve on them, and these ones have a sharp curve, and it's partly personal preference, and they just support things at slightly different angles. I normally use the flat ones. Another really popular support system is binding wire. So it's very thin steel wire which you can either cut and stitch your work. If you have a honeycomb piece, you could stitch it to the block to hold things in position. Or quite often what people do is if they have a chunky ring band or something similar and they're struggling to get a really nice tight join, they might wrap binding wire around the middle of the ring band and then twist to tighten it, and that will just help keep that join a little bit tighter while you're going through the soldering process. With all the things that I'm going to show you next, including the binding wire, it's really important to try and keep the wire away from where you're soldering, because the wire will also solder to your piece, and it also has to be removed before going in the pickle. So if you're working on something and it needs to stay with a nice tight point of contact, so for example here I've got a little rabbit that I cut out and two little pieces of silver bar. So if I wanted to solder them together like that, when I go near it with the torch, there's a chance that these joins might sort of loosen slightly, and therefore the soldering isn't going to work, or it's not going to be as effective as it could be. So what I can do is actually use supports to keep these elements where I want them with a really nice tight join. So one of the ways that I say that's really popular that you could do is use little bits of binding wire, cut them down either with your shears, or I've got a little pair of snips. So I've just got a little piece here and I'm going to make a little loop. Made another little loop of binding wire, and I'm just threading it over either side of my silver bar and pushing it down, and that's just going to help support that in place. I prefer using pre-made pins to do this, so there's a couple of different options that you can get. So a really popular option is using T-pins, which are little pins in the shape of a T. These you can find in knitting and crocheting supply shops and online, because they're normally used for sort of pinning out your crochet work, and all you do is slot them where you want that support. A similar idea to the T-pins are jewellery display pins. You can buy big bags of these. Sometimes they're made from steel, sometimes they're made from brass. They're the little pins that people put into the soft jewellery packaging and display packaging to hold the jewellery in place. And the nice thing about these is they're double pronged, so if you're trying to sport a larger area, these can be really handy. So for example, with the rabbit, I'm going to push down from his head and slot this into the brick. There we go. Now I just need to flux, add my solder, and I'm good to go. I've got my borax cone. I'm going to wet this, put it in the borax dish, grind it up until I've got a creamy paste. Take a paintbrush, pick up some of that paste, paint it where I want my solder to run. So that's the top of this T-join and the bottom of the rabbit's leg. Like that. And then I'm going to take two very small pieces of solder. I'm using hard solder and I'm placing one on the T-join, and I'm going to place one on the bottom of the rabbit's leg. Both pieces of solder are touching both sides of the join, so both sides of the pieces that I'm trying to join together. So for example, with the rabbit, the small bit of solder is touching the bottom of the rabbit's foot as well as the top of the T-bar, and with the rest of the T-bar, that little bit of solder is touching the bar going across as well as the bar going up and down. For the soldering to work, I need to get both sides of my join on all the elements the same temperature at the same time. So they all need to go that nice red colour for soldering, but they all need to do it at the same time. So little skinny things are probably going to get hotter quicker than big flat things. So I'm going to have to concentrate my heat in a way that I'm taking close attention to the colour and making sure that all elements are the same colour, the same heat at all times. I've turned the lights down so you can see the colour a little better. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just heat the area around my piece first so that the water content in the flux evaporates nice and slowly. I don't want that water content to boil, because if it boils it might knock my solder out of position. Now that the flux has gone white and crusty, I'm going to concentrate on heating the elements that I'm trying to join together. And I'm heating them to the same amount, same colour, at the same time. And that's it done. So all I need to do now is pick these pins out, and I'm going to use my insulated tweezers. There we go, one little bunny on a stick. Nice and attached. Nice, clean, neat joins, because I haven't done any clean up to this at all yet. So all I need to do now is pop it in the pickle pot until it gets rid of all the oxides, and then I would just give it a little buff with some sandpaper and a little polish. So I'm going to show you another way of joining things next. This time I've got the little sample ring from Make It Month 3 when we did a bit of forming without soldering, and I have another bunny, so I'm going to solder him onto there, and this time I'm going to use some cotter split pins. Cotter split pins are a little bit like hair slides, bobby pins. You find them in DIY shops, and they're just going to help clamp this in place. So I've got my two elements. I'm going to flux them. So I'm fluxing the top of the ring band, the back of the rabbit. Now ideally I would do some sweat soldering to do this, but I'm just going to show you how to do it without doing that. I'll talk to you about swatch soldering in a moment. So I'm going to take a little bit of hard silver solder again, pop that onto my ring, take my rabbet, ooh, pop that where I want it to go, and then, oh, as you can see, if left to its own device, it's rocking all over the place. So I'm going to use this pin to keep it held in position by opening it up and sliding it over both pieces. There you go, so that's now held in place, it's not going to fall off, and the solder's jammed between them. So I'm ready to give it a heat. I'm going to go and turn off all the lights again, so just give me a second. Light my torch. Now this time, coming back to both elements needing to be the same temperature, the ring band is a lot bigger than the rabbet and it's a lot lower down, so I need to concentrate all my heat on the ring band. I don't need to worry about the flux evaporating, the water evaporating slowly this time, because everything is held in position. The solder is pinned between the two elements. So I just need to get the ring up to temperature. I'm making sure that I get the ring up to temperature without the rabbit getting too hot. Especially small areas like the ears and tail, they would be liable for melting. And although I can't see what's going on, I now know by the colour that the soldering should have worked. So I'm going to turn the torch off, leave it for a little second to cool down, take my insulated tweezers again, take the pin off, and there it's stuck. Sweat soldering is used when you want to do a very neat job of attaching one thing on top of another thing, normally a smaller thing onto a larger thing. So in this case it's going to be the little rabbit onto this textured background, or quite often it's things like a strip of wire or a little coiled shape onto a background, and it's used when you don't want to see solder seeping out the edges. So if you imagine if we did this the normal way, if I just flux these a little minute, so I'm going to flux my rabbit, flux where I want it to go, and then if I was to get a piece of solder, put it on my brick, pick up my rabbit, put the rabbit on top, that rabbit's going to be balancing on that little bit of solder, so it's going to be rocking around, and then when that solder melts and turns liquid, because even though the solder's tiny, it still has a little bit of thickness to it. When it melts and turns liquid, that rabbit will drop down and it could skittle across the surface. So what we're going to do instead, I'm going to put the solder on the back of the rabbit. So I'm going to put one piece on his main part of his body, and I'm going to put a tiny piece up by his head. Like so. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat the two pieces, and I'm going to heat this until the solder runs completely flat. The main way, the proper way to do this would be I would heat the rabbit until the solder runs, I would then clean it, I would sand the excess solder back so it was completely flat, reflux it, flux this, heat them both, put the rabbit in place, and then heat this until the solder ran. That takes a couple of extra steps, so I've got a cheats way of doing it, which is what I'm going to show you, the quick way. Because my base is the bigger part, I'm going to heat this first. I'm going to keep heating it until it gives a nice dull pinky red colour, and when the flux has gone clear and glassy. So about now, and now I'm going to start heating my rabbit. Now I'm going to keep heating the rabbit until the solder runs. So the solder's just run, but if you can see, it's in a little pool. It's a little pool of solder, so it's still slightly raised, which is why I should now clean it and sand it back. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to keep heating it, because that pool will actually flatten out a lot more and spread further. I'm going to keep heating it. And in a second, that little pool of solder is going to go flatter and it's going to spread further across the surface of my metal. Sometimes you can use a soldering pick to help with this as well. That'll do. Turn it off. Now I'm going to pick it up and place it on my background exactly where I want it. So that looks like the middle to me. Whoa. And now I'm going to heat my torch, light my torch. And heat both bits, but again, if you remember, the larger surface will require more heat to get up to temperature, so I'm focusing all my heat on that background, and for the time being I'm trying to avoid the rabbit. When the background's getting up to temperature, then I will start heating both pieces together. And there you go. All nice and soldered, nice and flat. The rabbit didn't move from the position that I put it in. And again, all it needs is a little cleanup now, and it's ready to turn into a piece of jewellery. So that's sweat soldering. Like I say, that's very much the cheats way of doing it. I'm going to put the instructions for the proper way of doing it in the description underneath the video. I'm going to pop this little dude in the pickle to clean. So here we have a little bunny on a stick, and this was soldered together with a little help from the T-pins and the jewellery display pins. These are the same ones that I used to actually solder that together, so as you can see they're reusable. And then we have little bunny, can't quite see him because he's shiny, little bunny soldered onto the round ring, nice and flush, and that was achieved using the support of the cotter split pin. These little cotter pins are also really good if you are ever soldering something small and round, and of course it might be wobbling around on your soldering brick. You could nestle, you could sit it on top of that little open circle at the end, and that just helps balls sit nice and steady while you're then soldering things to the top. And we have the little rabbit on the textured background, and this is the one that we sweat soldered. So remember, with the sweat soldering, I'm going to put some comments in the video about it, just to go through the proper process with you. Like I say, this was very much the cheats method, but it works for me and it speeds it up no end. I find it a lot easier. Especially when you've got a larger classroom environment. It just means that people aren't having to go through as many processes to end up with exactly the same result.